the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
It's great to be back at Castle Point. A lot of fond memories of my 4 years here, so thank you, Dibs, for inviting me. I think he's given you a bit of background on who I am, and I'm here tonight to speak a little bit about the role of renewable energy in the overall concept of sustainability, and even more specifically about what are the business considerations around the growth of renewable energy, the growth that's taken place so far, as well as the growth that we hope to see continue for the expansion of renewables in the marketplace. I don't know if anybody's familiar with a gentleman by the name of Amory Lovins. Thank you. Amory Lovins was probably one of the pioneers in the field of sustainability going back to the 1970s, and he's associated with the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a think tank and a consultancy around sustainability and a sustainable planet. And to pull together the business side as well as the sustainability side, I have a quote from Amory, who I did one time have the pleasure of sharing a lunch table with about 25 years ago, which is a really unique experience. But Mr. Lovins said, because what we are spreading in the world makes sense and makes money, and can therefore be market-led and driven, and produce the outcomes that people of many beliefs and persuasions want, we are really going in the right direction. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that concept today and that direction today. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction of who I am and my company, because that'll give you the context of how I'm speaking to what I'm speaking to. I'm going to talk a bit about the renewables market and why it's grown and why it is growing, and then the business side of why people invest in renewables, and when they want to invest, what do they buy and how do they buy it, and give you a little summary of what I see going forward. So first of all, I'm with the Con Edison family of companies. Con Edison Inc. is a New York Stock Exchange traded company. It owns a couple of utility businesses, the primary one being across the river, the utility for New York City. It also owns a large scale transmission and gas pipeline business, Con Edison Transmission. The part of the company that I represent is called the clean energy businesses. The clean energy businesses are about a 22-year-old part of Con Edison. They were launched before renewables were all the rage, but they were launched to take part in the energy business outside of New York State and in the non-utility part of the energy business. If you talk about sustainability being the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profitability, we're obviously focused on being profitable while serving the needs of the people and the planet. We do all sizes of renewable, solar from residential homes, rooftops, all the way out to 300 million watt solar farms in the western desert. So we have a big interest in renewables. It is the major part of our business. We also do some energy efficiency, but renewables is a big part of what we do. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So we all understand the role of renewables in sustainability. This is actually a picture of one of our sites at a Honda Motors factory out in Ohio, where we installed some wind. But the most important factor if renewables are going to continue to grow, kind of keying off what A. Marie Lovin said, is that is it going to be cost effective and a good investment for buyers and sellers to invest in renewables going forward? And to answer that question, it starts with the cost of the technology. So this is a chart showing the progression of the cost of wind turbines. If you go back just 10 years ago to the 2008-2009 timeframe, those costs were up over $2 a watt, whereas today you're looking at a cost of less than $1 a watt. So that's a pretty dramatic change in only a decade. And that's been driven by larger, more efficient turbines that can go in the same footprint. So whereas you might have had a 1 megawatt wind turbine a decade ago on the top of a tower, you're probably looking at a 2 megawatt land-based wind turbine on top of a tower today. If you're talking about offshore wind, which is a growing area, those are moving up to 10 megawatt towers. So those turbines are also becoming more efficient, whereas a decade ago, the capacity factor, meaning the percentage of time that they are producing energy versus the total energy they could produce 8760 a year. So that capacity factor a decade ago was in the 30%, low 30s range. In recent years, that's been north of 40%, and it's moving rapidly to 50%. So all of that drives better economics for wind. The lower cost of the turbines, as well as the better output of the turbines that you're installing, are all combining to make a better economic picture, and therefore driving the ability to install more wind. There's a similar story around solar. This one goes back a little further in time, back to 1976, but in constant 2018 dollars, you can see it was almost $100 a watt for a solar panel or module. That's what the photo is on the right. If you fast forward to today, that's well below $1 a watt, right? About 40 cents a watt, which is very, very dramatic. There's a number of factors that have driven it that way. Lower material costs is one. The silicon is less expensive now. Better manufacturing techniques, more efficient manufacturing techniques. And then finally, on the economic side, for better or for worse, most of the manufacturing has moved out of the United States and Europe and into East Asia, China, Korea, Malaysia, and the Chinese government really put a focus on solar about a decade ago, and as a result, the increase in production capacity has really driven down the cost as well, the economies of scale there. There's a lot of talk recently in the news about solar tariffs that the current administration put on solar panels coming out of China. The chart on the left shows you how those tariffs are being implemented. It's 30% of the value of the panels in 2018 and then going down over 4 years. The middle chart shows you the price impact, and I think what's important here is even with the impact of about 10 cents of tariff costs in 2018, panels in 2018 are still cheaper than they were just 2 years ago, even with the tariff on top. So it really has only been a speed bump for the market. People were saying, oh, it's going to kill the solar market. We haven't experienced that. You look at the 2018 cost of 42 cents, we're actually seeing a little bit lower than that as a large buyer, so it's really fine. And because the panels are only about 35% of the total cost of a project, you have panels, you have inverters, you have racks, you have other equipment and other soft costs. The chart on the right shows that in 2018, it's only added about 8% to the cost, the total capital cost of building a large-scale solar. So, you see it was $1.12 a watt in 2017, and now it's maybe slightly more now. It looks like about $1.13 is what's shown here, but not really enough to substantially impact the market. That's the good news. So what does that mean? That translates into renewables now being cost competitive with the overall cost of power in the grid. So this takes some explaining. LCOE, that stands for levelized cost of energy. And the way you arrive at that is you add up the cost of building the plant, and then the cost of running and maintaining it over its life, and you divide the total kilowatt hours of electricity that's going to produce over its life, and that will give you a levelized cost of energy across the whole life of the plant. The descriptions on the bottom of the chart represent different power pools. There are different regions of the country, different power grids. Some of them are self-explanatory: Southwest California, New York. ERCOT is Texas, it stands for Electric Reliability Council of Texas. PJM is Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland Interconnect, which covers most of the Mid-Atlantic, all the way out to Illinois. The point here is, if you look at the, whatever it's showing up as, pinkish gray bars in the middle there, they show the prices in the power grid. In each of those regional power grids, there are market prices. The yellow bars represent the price of solar on the LCOE basis, and the blue is wind. And the takeaway here is that right now, renewables are cost competitive with grid power across much of the U.S. And in some places like the Midwest, ISO, MISO, you can see that wind power in some cases is actually trending cheaper than the overall mix of production on the grid. That's very significant. That's very, very significant. I think there's still a perception in some places that renewables are somehow much more expensive power, while in fact that's not the case across much of the United States. So what does that mean for renewables? If you look at the chart on the left, that shows the share of the overall generation mix by fuel type over the last 10 years. If you look at 2008, you can see renewables, the blue block on the top, was only about 9% of the mix. It's doubled in just 10 years, from 9 to 18%. The other part that's gone up significantly is natural gas, and the combination of those two, what's really displaced has been coal. Obviously coal's in the news a lot. The simple economics, as we saw from the earlier chart, are really weighing heavily on coal, as are the economics of natural gas. So there's a growing portion of the generation mix that is cleaner, certainly the renewables, but gas itself is also cleaner. The other part that's interesting is that if you look at the chart on the lower right, that's how the generation, that's each year's generation construction. So if you look at the early 2000s, the gray bars represent a lot of gas-fired generation going in back then, and that's a period of time where that was becoming much more cost-effective, so you could see the real increase in natural gas. But continue to the right, and you start to see, beginning around 2007 and 2008, if you think back to the earlier charts of the decline in the cost of renewables, that was a big factor. The other big factor was the advent of financeability of renewables. When Wall Street banks, whatever you want to call it, began to see them as a viable investment alternative, that also helped improve the cost structure of installing plants. And you can see that since 2007, the share of the generation mix going in a given year has shifted to be predominantly renewable. Still some natural gas, but a very, very strong renewable component. So when you talk about renewables, you're talking about a number of different types of generation. Hydropower is one that's been around a long time, and I don't know if you talk about, some people say there's better hydro and not so good hydro depending on your point of view. There's geothermal generation, which is generation coming from the heat of the earth. There is biomass generation, and there's a few different flavors of that, and then of course there's solar and wind. This zooms in rather a little bit on the previous slide, and you can see that within renewables where the growth is coming from. So you can see hydro has been fairly steady, not a lot of change in the last decade. Geothermal is not very significant. Biomass has not changed substantially either. You can see the growth in renewables has been in two technologies, wind and solar. So when you look at that doubling that occurred from a 9% share to an 18% share, that's been driven by wind and solar, and it's been because of those cost curves that you saw on the earlier slides. So wind, there's still more wind than solar, but you can see certainly in the more recent years, the growth rate of solar has been very strong. Now, what does that mean? That's certainly good. It's better for an emission standpoint. It's certainly a sustainability benefit, but it is not without problems. And the problems are both engineering or operational issues, as well as some economic challenges. I'm going to talk through this. There's a lot going on here. The chart on the left is what's becoming known as the Dunkirk Curve, and this is a chart of net load in the state of California. And I want to kind of focus initially on this 2012, that's this gray line here. This is what the load curve looked like on January 11th, 2012 in the state of California. So, not surprisingly, not a lot of electricity being used at 3 a.m. There's still obviously usage, but the load grows through the morning, and it was kind of steady through the day. And then there's a phenomenon in the late afternoon where some folks are getting home from jobs or school and starting to use more energy in the home, yet businesses are still in operation. So very typical utility load profile around the nation is that you start to see that load grow where you have the overlaps of homes and businesses, and then as the businesses, some of them begin to trail off, the load starts to slope down overnight and repeat the cycle. Now, the other lines represent subsequent years after 2012, and you see something interesting going on here. The belly of the duck, as it's called, is getting closer to the bottom, and the neck of the duck is getting very steep. It's almost turning into a goose or a swan, and they have to rename it the Swan Curve soon. But the phenomenon that's going on there is indicative of tremendous success California has achieved in introducing solar into its energy grid. There's a great deal of rooftop solar in California. There's additional solar in large-scale solar farms. Not surprisingly, so solar puts out its highest production at the height of the day, at noontime. And what you're seeing here is the net load being impacted by the solar. So as the solar comes online in the morning hour, you see that net load start to fall off as it's being displaced by the solar production. But the bad news here is that the sun starts to set at some point. And as the sun starts to set, but the load, the nature of the load going back to 2012 still increases through the afternoon, something's got to make up for that. As the solar is ramping down and the load is ramping up, something has to make up for that. The way the system was designed over the 100 years of central generation was you had big plants, many years ago were coal, then nuclear, and now gas. But these plants, they had a name called base load, which meant they were the basic load following plants. They got turned on, and they stayed on. And they were not designed to ramp up and down rapidly. There were other types of plants that had a role in doing that. But the people who manage the grid are now challenged with a problem in that you see where the start stops are. This is what they're asking their big plants to do now. It's not healthy for those plants. It's not how they are designed. It makes them less efficient. So the solar, while overall is good, it has created challenges to those operators who have to manage the grid, because the grid is not always designed to absorb the energy the way the renewables are delivering it. And so they're trying to work on that. The other interesting thing that you see, I mean, this explains the duck curve on the upper right. You can see the average hourly solar generation kind of is the inverse of the belly of the duck here. But here's the other interesting thing. You can see the average, so electricity is a commodity. It's priced in hourly increments in the regional power markets. In 2012, this was the value of energy produced in the middle of the day. Because, from Economics 101, supply and demand, right, set price, with all of the additional supply in the middle of the day, the price has fallen significantly. Why is that important? Because it makes it harder for that next watt of generation, be it solar or any other kind, to come into the market. So if you're trying to introduce yet more renewables, but somebody has to be able to pay for that, the way they pay for that is selling the power, the power is less valuable. So the more sort of in a conundrum, the more solar you get, the less valuable that next watt of solar is. So that's a challenge to getting more sustainable generation into the grid. I thought this was important enough to spend some time on because we all want more renewables. I think that's, if you look at surveys, most people want more renewables, but we're going to have to solve some of these economic and operational challenges in order to have that achieved. And there is one way to do that, and that's energy storage. One of the unique things about electricity is that it's not that easily stored. We don't really think about it, but when we flip a switch on, we expect the lights to show up. We don't expect there to be a delay. The operators of the electricity grid are every second balancing supply and demand, and it's actually pretty amazing how they do that. There are ways to store electricity. Over the years, they've had reservoirs at higher elevations where they would pump it up when usage was low overnight and then allow it to fall during the day and turn a turbine. Hydropower with the large dams, and think Hoover Dam, that's one way of storing energy that you can turn into electricity when you need it. The way that people are looking to now more, because the economics are starting to get more favorable, is batteries. And if you think back a few slides ago, you saw some cost curves of wind turbines and solar panels. This is a similar type of graph showing the cost of batteries on a $1 per kilowatt hour basis over the last several years, as well as a forecast for where it's going in the future. Cost-effective storage will really help us bring more renewables to bear to make the grid more sustainable. And so a lot of people are hopeful that this is going to continue. The promising thing here is that what's really going to help the cost of batteries overall is not so much stationary storage combined with renewables, but electric vehicles. If you've looked at some of the national commitments to electric vehicles and some of the state goals in California and New York and some of the other states, as the ramp up of electric cars, electric vehicles occur, that's going to lead to much more battery production. And again, kind of like you saw with solar modules, as you get an increase in production capacity, that will drive prices down. So renewables will be the beneficiary to some extent of the changes we're seeing in the transportation sector, all for the good. So it's a virtuous cycle. The batteries that will make transportation more sustainable will also help make energy more sustainable, generation, distribution of energy. So this is all very good news from a sustainability perspective. So we talked a little bit about the market generally. How does the business of renewables work? Getting back to sustainability and 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit. Where's the profit in all of this, and why do people do it? So there's 2 sides to every transaction. There's somebody who's selling and someone who's buying, hopefully. I'm on the side of folks who sell energy. We risk our shareholders' money, our owners' money, by investing in solar and investing in wind, and we make a commitment to the owners to make a return on their money. That's how it works. So from my perspective, as somebody who wants to invest in renewables, well, how am I going to make money on that? So there's a number of values that we stack up in order to make back and make a return on our investment. First of all, we sell the energy. That's the kilowatt hours, the megawatt hours, same things that you see on your monthly residential electricity bill. There's another payment, not as significant for renewables as for, say, a large nuclear plant, but there's something called capacity in many power markets where you kind of get a payment for standing by. So for being there and being available to the grid, they will compensate you. Because renewables are intermittent, you can't predict if the wind is going to blow, and you can't predict a summer rainstorm that's going to cover the sun and lower your solar production. They do not get their full nameplate rating on a capacity basis, so that's not as lucrative for renewables as it might be for a different type of fuel source, but it can help. Where the sustainability angle comes in is something called environmental attributes, and these have different names. These are state designated typically. In some states they're called RECs, renewable energy credits. In other states they specify solar renewable energy credits. Some states are called ZRECs for zero emission. Everybody seems like their own acronym. But this was a way the market came up with to help generate more renewables. And so the way this works is for every 1,000 kilowatt hours, every megawatt hour of energy that a renewable plant produces, a solar or a wind plant produces, they get a certificate for what's called a REC or a ZREC or an SREC as appropriate. And that has value. In some states, the utilities or the other energy retailers are required to get a certain percentage of the load they serve from renewable sources. And the way they prove they did that is through these renewable energy credits, these certificates. And so if you have one of these, there's people who need them and will buy them from you. Sometimes they travel with the electricity, but often they are sold separately. And that's important because that's a very valuable piece of the economic stream in some of the markets. So when you're investing in renewables, you have to know what the local market rules and conditions are, and how much value there is to that, because that factors into your investment decision. What's important about that too is that the ultimate holder of that gets to make the green claim. So if I produce the power and I get that certificate, if I keep it and never give it away, I can say I have the green bona fides, I've made the green power. If I sell that to somebody else, they get the credit for the green, okay? So it can only be counted once, and they are tracked. There's various mechanisms for tracking them, and they can change hands a number of times, but the last person or entity to hold them is the one who gets the credit for being sustainable and green. It's an important part of the overall renewables market, and it's working very well in many places. The other thing is societally, at the federal level, and that was all at the state level. At the federal level, some number of years ago, they decided to incent renewables with a variety of tax credits. One is called the investment tax credit, and the other one is called the production tax credit. The difference is one you get up front, right after you put the plant into operation. That's the investment tax credit. The production tax credit typically applied to wind. You get that for each kilowatt hour that you generate, so that's why it's based on your production output. Various reasons for that, but they are there, and they are continuing to be there for a few more years, but because of the cost curves, as you saw earlier, coming down, those are phasing out because they're frankly not going to be needed, because we're already getting cost competitive with conventional forms of energy. And then locally, depending on the state or the utility, there could be cash grants, there could be rebates, or various other kinds of incentives, property tax abatements. So it's very important to know all of that, either, whoever, if you're investing in solar for your home personally, or me as a business leader investing in renewables for my shareholders, I need to understand all of that before I make an investment. There's actually a very good website from NC State University, dsireusa.org, that state by state tracks all of this, and you can go in there and see all kinds of things around rebates, net metering, energy efficiency grants, renewable grants. NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, also has some info on that as well. So that's, from my perspective, what I put together to return an investment that I would make in a renewable installation. But what about the other side of it? If I'm going to sell renewables, somebody's going to buy it. Why do people buy renewables? So when I look at my customers, there are a number of reasons they may buy renewables. The green in green energy is money. For most customers, this represents cost savings. Because of the incentives that are available and the falling cost of the technologies, most of the value propositions that go forward for customers are that we can save you money on your cost of electricity by supplying you with solar or wind generator electricity. That's very significant. In other cases, people will not take upfront savings, or maybe you can't achieve it. But the other thing it provides them is a price hedge, because most generation requires a fuel, natural gas, coal, uranium. The price of the output of that plant would track with the cost of the fuel. Well, the beauty of wind and sunshine is you're not paying for it. So I can sign a contract once I know my installation costs. I know what price I have to charge for that energy for 20 years, and I can tell the customer for 20 years forward, this will be your price of electricity that comes from this facility, as opposed to being subject to the market conditions of the grid. That's very attractive if you're a corporation, of having a known cost, if not for 100% of your energy, but for some portion of it well into the future. That's a big motivator for people, known costs. Then, of course, there's the green mandate. These are not government mandates yet, but in many cases there is an edict from the executive management, or there may be pressure from shareholders, investors in a corporation that say, we want this corporation to be more sustainable, more green. That's what a lot of you are studying in your curriculum here. So people will buy the renewable energy in order to meet a green mandate that they may have. And that gets us back to those renewable energy credits. In order to claim that, they have to get possession and keep those renewable energy credits. And those have a value to them, so they do pay for those. Some of the people will do that. They will pay for those because they know they want to be green, and that's how they achieve that. Then, of course, there's the marketing piece. There's been some, companies, you think of companies, say, like a Patagonia, whose image is all outdoors and sustainability. They were sort of in the forefront of issues like this, but many, many, many more companies are now starting to understand the value of sustainability and sustainability principles, of which energy is and can be and is a component. And so there's many ways to achieve that, and I'm going to get to that in the next slide, but I wanted to break out this concept of additionality, because what many of the most progressive companies now are insisting on is not just that they're getting the output of a renewable energy facility, but rather that you're building one just for them. And that's this concept of additionality. The companies are saying, because of my action, there's now an additional production facility of renewable energy being attached to the grid. Not that I'm helping the plant that's already out there stay profitable and maybe reinvest. I actually want to know that I helped build an additional plant. And the most progressive companies are now moving into this additionality camp. So how do these companies become more sustainable by utilizing renewable energy? If you went back a number of years ago, where this really began is people purchasing certificates. And so this could be a company in New Hampshire who buys these renewable energy certificates from a wind farm in Texas. They pay for them and they retire them. They put them in a drawer, never to be sold again. As I explained earlier, they get then to claim the greenness, if you will, of that electricity. So for many companies, that is how they entered the market. And for a long time, that was basically the largest component of the market. That was what was most available. And these were often national, which meant that the firm could be anywhere in the U.S. and the wind farm or the solar farm could be anywhere else in the U.S. And they would just buy those. As the thinking became more progressive, people started to say, no, I don't want stuff from across the continent. I want to know that it was produced in my local grid. So that power got fed into the grid in my local power pool. And so supply and demand, often those were more expensive because there may not have been as much supply, say in the state of New York, for the demand in the state of New York. And so there was a pricing differential between those two types of certificates. The other option that people can take is just to invest their own money. Businesses will say, hey, I'm going to take $1 million and build a solar installation on my rooftop or in my parking lot. And many companies started to go that route when you saw the price of renewables falling. It was prohibitive early on, but as the price came down, some people went in that direction. That's not typical, only because if you're a manufacturer and you've got an extra $1 million, you probably want to put it into the manufacturing plant to improve your manufacturing capacity, not get into the energy business. So the concept of third-party ownership began to really take off in the 2007-2008 timeframe when financiers agreed to start financing these plants. And that was a concept where me as a green energy business would go to a business customer and say, you want solar but you don't want to invest in it, I'll invest in it. I'll build it for you. Just give me access to your roof. I'll design it, I'll construct it, I'll own it, operate it, maintain it for 20 years. What I need from you, so I can finance this, is a 20-year contract. So you'll commit to buying whatever I produce over 20 years. And that's what we call a power purchase agreement. So some of the key deal terms on that is typically the length of the contract, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, the price of the energy, the production. They usually want some minimum production guarantees. And then, of course, who gets ownership for the green energy? Who gets that certificate? If the customer wants it, they're going to have to pay for that somehow in a higher, probably PPA price, kilowatt hour price. If they allow me to keep it and sell it to help make my return, I can give them a lower kilowatt hour price. So that went well for a while. And as the thinking progressed, you began to have customers who wanted much more of this renewable energy they can produce on site, or they want to invest even above and beyond their local need. So if you think of a data center, they're very power intensive in a small footprint. They're really at the forefront, the Apples, the Googles, the Amazons, and they wanted to buy more renewables. They began to look at buying it from farms off-site. And this concept of a virtual PPA, which is, I'm going to explain on the next slide, it allows you to get the economic benefits of the power and the green benefits, even if it's not on your site. A little tricky, but I'll walk through a quick example. We don't get too deep into it. And then finally, for those who are in regulated utility territories, the utilities saw an opportunity here to meet a customer need as well as to participate in this. And so in some jurisdictions, the utilities now have special rates or tariffs, as it's called in utility lingo, where the power for the business consumers is now green. They may install a utility-owned solar farm or wind farm just for the purposes of supplying the power under this green tariff. So just a real quick thing on what is a virtual PPA. You can't steer electrons. They tend to go where the voltage differential takes them. So you have to figure out a way for the consumer to benefit and to make an arrangement where it works, even if the power plant is off-site. The way this is done is it's called a contract for differences. The customer and the owner of the power plant, the renewable power plant, settle on price, say 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's a firm fixed price. Now, since I'm not on their roof, I'm not giving the power right to their load, I'm just selling it out to the grid. The contract has a provision that whatever I sell the power for, the proceeds of that go back to the customer to offset the 5 cents they're paying me. So if they're paying me 5 cents and I happen to sell it for 4.5 cents, their net cost is only 0.5 cent. So that's why it works economically for them. In most cases, they also want the green certificates out of this, and so they work out the price so that they get the green certificates. The actual power for their facility is still coming from the utility, right from the grid, but the power from the renewable plant is going into that grid. Typically, sometimes it's more remote, but the transaction is financial. There is an agreement on the green energy credits, and so it can work for both parties, although it's a lot more complex from a contractual standpoint than the typical on-site PPA. And it really takes a corporate commitment to negotiate one of these. Many folks actually use advisors on this. It can bring in, various departments, tax and legal and procurement and facilities. So it is not a simple undertaking, but it is becoming very popular. As you can see from this slide, this is a worldwide look at the growth of these corporate PPAs. These are specifically the off-site ones, not the on-site ones, over the last several years. So you can see in the 2010, 11, 12, they're almost non-existent. And then since 2013, they've just been taking off. And this is a focus on the United States. You can see the purplish color is this virtual PPA, this offsite, becoming a much more significant part of the market because you're not limited by what you can fit on the footprint of the customer site. So the trade-off is you can do more, but it's a hell of a lot more complex. Hasn't slowed down the market, as you can see. And the stacked bars on the right are a little hard to see, but what it shows is that the early buyers were some of the more progressive sustainability leaders like the Googles, like the Microsofts. Believe it or not, Walmart, people don't necessarily associate Walmart, those who are not in the know, but they've been one of the pioneers in solar. They have huge penetration of solar across their corporate footprint. Since then, though, it's really expanded beyond those early adopters. So if you look at the chart on the left for 2018 year to date, you can see it growing beyond the Facebooks and the Walmarts and the Microsofts to folks like AT&T, T-Mobile, MGM Resorts. So now that, like a lot of these things, once the market gets established and the contracting mechanism gets established, it goes beyond the early adopters into a much wider audience. There's a number of corporations. Just a little frozen here. Sure what happened here. There we go. Okay. So, it's been a great broadening, and going back, this is a chart from 2016, and from the bubbles, the purplish bubbles are the certificates, those green energy certificates that I spoke of earlier, and the yellow is the on-site generation, and then the bluish is the off-site wind. So you can see that the large majority of purchases in 2016 were represented by people buying these certificates. And that was really what the market had most available back in that day. Fast forward now to 2018, and you can see that while there's still a lot of certificate purchases going on, the on-site generation and the off-site solar and the off-site wind have taken a much bigger share of the market, and you see a much more diverse group of customers, Anheuser-Busch, Procter & Gamble, General Motors, participating in this market where it's not that they're buying national certificates any longer, they're moving towards this additionality angle, which is I'm going to strike a contract, and that contract is going to result in a brand new additional solar or wind energy installation being constructed and added to the generation mix. And they're really leading the way in sustainability by doing that. This is good news for both the planet and for my business. There's a group called the AR100 Companies, and these are companies who have made public commitments to getting 100% of their energy from renewable sources. Some of them have very aggressive goals to move there quickly. Others have more longer-term goals, but nonetheless, they've all gone on record as saying we are actively working to ensure that 100% of our energy consumption comes from renewable sources. And so the colored-in blocks are representing purchases that they've already made to start to contract for renewable energy. The red line represents the solid red line represents the estimated renewable electricity demand out into the future to meet the goals that they've laid out. And those transparent rectangles with the numbers in them represent the differential between what they've already got under contract and what they will need to contract for in order to meet their publicly stated targets. So I've lost count. I think there's about 125 to 150 corporations who have made the RE100 commitment, and more are going public every month with that type of a commitment. So from a sustainability perspective, these folks are really leading the way, and that kind of commitment, the virtuous cycle is that it will attract more investors into the renewable market, which should help drive down prices, which should help stimulate demand for more renewables. So we started to enter into what I would call that virtuous cycle of growing sustainability through additional renewables. Now, as I said, in not all places do people go to third parties for that. In some cases, the utilities have been able to step up and institute green tariffs to supply the likes of the Apples and the other corporates in their service areas that want to purchase green power. And this just gives you a bit of a look across the country of where those are available. 5. Okay, great. Right on track. So I think what's important here is that you have a willing market of buyers, which is the corporates. They're not being mandated. They're not under any government mandate to buy renewables at this time. Yet you see them stepping forward and making commitments, and stronger commitments, going from buying relatively inexpensive national renewable energy certificates to local renewable energy certificates, to power purchase agreements, to virtual power purchase agreements, and stepping up that commitment. And you have many more investors coming into the market who are stepping up to supply that. And the combination of those factors, and we're not being mandated to do that. We're doing it because there's the profit potential in it for us. We can do well by doing good. And the two parties are willingly meeting to achieve a goal that's important to the planet, which is cleaner air, more renewably sourced energy. And so, what's my summary on all of this? Progress on sustainability does not have to wait for government mandates and government regulations. There may be a place for that, but it can be accelerated simply through smart business, developing good markets with willing buyers and willing sellers. Renewables, as I showed earlier, are increasingly cost competitive with traditional sources of power for a variety of reasons. In the past few years, they were helped by incentives, whether it be federal tax credits or other incentives. But because of the declining costs of developing these projects, they're now getting to the point where those incentives are largely being reduced or phased out totally, and they are still showing cost competitiveness. Businesses have a variety of motivations for investing in renewables. Sometimes it's because of investor pressure, sometimes it's because of the employees or the leadership of the corporation having just the commitment personally. But or sometimes, very importantly, it's because they can save money on their energy supply or have a stable price of energy for a foreseeable period into the future. So regardless of what their motivations are, the markets have responded by providing a number of different ways for them to achieve their goals. Some more cost-effective, some more costly, but with different levels of sustainability component in them. Altogether, though, they're combining to drive the growth of renewables, which is displacing, as you saw from the earlier chart, predominantly coal-fired generation, which, other than if you're in the coal-fired generation business, is probably a pretty good thing. One of the challenges, as we saw from the California example, is in optimizing these renewables. You can't just keep adding them to the system indefinitely, because it starts to have operational and economic adds economic problems to the overall system. But it's not without hope, because there is the ability to store that energy, becoming more cost effective. We're already starting to see it in the highest cost markets like Hawaii and California. And as the costs of batteries continue to be driven down largely by the transportation sector, that will have benefits to the renewable energy sector as storage supplements solar and wind to add cost-effective time shifting of those resources. And I would be, I think, remiss after all this talk about renewable generation and adding more renewables to not mention energy efficiency. Sure, it's great to supply your power from renewable sources, but it's certainly most cost effective and most sustainable to optimize your usage to start. So, I think across the board we'd agree that the best thing to do is not waste a kilowatt hour or waste a therm of gas or oil. So we always talk to customers about being efficient and sizing the generation that they may want that's renewable to the most efficient load at the site. So if you're using 1 million kilowatt hours, but you could reduce that to 900,000 kilowatt hours, let's start with that and then build renewables to supply 900,000 kilowatt hours, because that is the most effective strategy, usually from a cost standpoint, but certainly from an efficiency standpoint. So I think I'm right on time, Dibs. I tried to hit you there. So I want to thank you for having me today. It's been a pleasure. If you want to find out more about Con Edison and what it does around sustainability as a corporation, there is the Con Edison Sustainability Report publicly available on the website at this address. You can go in there and see across all the Con Edison companies that I showed you earlier, not just the clean energy business, but across all their utilities and Con Edison Transmission, the various activities they've undertaken to be a more sustainable corporation. I wish you luck in your curriculum here. Enjoy the winter break, and thanks again for having me.